You most likely have heard of the name if you have even dabbled in video games, well known for series like Sonic and Yakuza, Yakuza, but they have been around for decades, and prior to 2001 released a bunch of consoles, with their most popular, at least in the West, the Sega Mega Drive, or if you live in the land of the red, white and blue, the Genesis. But you probably already know that too, seeing a bunch of merchandise with the logos on, as well as a bunch of millennials like myself that talked about it online. Alongside the Super Nintendo was one of the first consoles I ever got to experience playing the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog. That became my gateway to the medium. The Mega Drive was a fantastic console that I believe is still worth playing today with many games to choose from. But today, I would only be talking about 15 of them, which were hard to decide which ones to talk about. Before we start, I do want to point out that I won't be diving into the Sonic and Streets of Rage trilogy, as for the former, he gets enough love as it is, and I may be tempted to give each trilogy a video to themselves. This also isn't a countdown video, and more so games that I would recommend playing any way you can. In the meantime, grab a snack and a drink, 'cause it's time to talk about 15 Mega Drive games worth playing. The Mega Drive debuted in 1988 in Japan, 89 in the States, and 1990 in Europe, and was designed to bring the arcade experience at home using a new 16-bit CPU technology. The Japan's launch was small, only having Space Harrier 2, and alright sequel to Space Harrier, but it's just better to play the original nowadays, and Super Thunder Blade, which just sucks. Not a good launch variety, only having arcade rail shooters. The US and Europe had better launch titles, showing off what the system can do to bring the arcade experience at home, and while the games weren't one-to-one with their arcade counterparts, they were impressive, especially since this was before the Super Nintendo, so most people at home only had games not yet like this. One of the launch titles for Europe was a port of Capcom's arcade demon hunted sequel, Ghouls and Ghosts. You star as the valiant knight Sir Arthur, who you may know from the Versus games, who must save the souls of Princess Prinprin and the human realm from the demon lord Lucifer by entering the demon's home turf and go through 5 Ghoulian trials. Twice. Despite wearing a can of armor, Arthur can only take 2 hits before crumbling into bones, which you'll be seeing a lot as this game is difficult, with enemies that will constantly spawn and attack immediately. This game requires a lot of patience to get through, but thankfully in this version, you can continue as many times as you like without pumping pennies into your console. Your jumps are also committed, so one false move could cost you your life. Arthur throws an infinite amount of weapons at the demons, which vary from javelins, knives, axes, holy water, and more. No, the best option is the knife, as it comes out faster, while weapons like the holy water should be avoided, as it only covers the ground, even when thrown upwards. These weapons usually appear randomly in chests, and if you grab one, then you are committed to it, until you find another. It can be a problem if you get knocked back, or accidentally jump into the one weapon, which can make a run better or worse. What makes Ghouls and Ghosts a step up from its predecessor is the ability to use magic from the golden armor, which can cause various spells depending on the weapon you are holding, from a lightning bolt to duplicating yourself. One of the biggest additions is the ability to fire upwards as well as downwards. The latter are only in midair, which makes hitting enemies slightly easier, and the levels are designed with this in mind, especially in Stage 1 when you are climbing up the hills, and Stage 3 when there are multiple enemies above you. Sadly, this ability was replaced in the Super Nintendo sequel Super Ghouls and Ghosts with a double jump. I think the Mega Drive is the better game out of the two and surpasses the original Ghosts and Goblins with flying colours. There are a few things that annoy me. For one, these red devils are so annoying to fight, especially when there are 2 of them, and having to restart the entire game again to fully complete it seems like padding, but I think just doing 1 run is perfectly fine. The game is still fun and rewarding, especially for people looking for a challenge. The port is also impressive looking, as good as its arcade counterpart, and while you can play the arcade game with ease thanks to many Capcom collections, this port is a valid choice. The port itself was done by the staff at Sega and was programmed by Matsuhide Mizoguchi and Yuji Naka, known prior for their work on the first Phantasy Star. Ghouls and Ghosts played a part in the creation of Sonic, as it was a learning experience for Naka, who was interested in how the ships worked. The game also played a big role for Sega, as not only it blossomed the relationship between Capcom and Sega, making them one of the biggest supporters for the rest of Sega's life in the console business, but also attracted more companies into making games for their systems, some I will mention in this video. But before, I do want to talk about another game during the early days of the system. I was very young at the time, not even in the double digits, so my memory is hazy, but I vaguely remember having a cartridge that contained a bunch of the early games for the system, ranging from a football game, beating 'em ups, to columns. While this isn't my exact copy back in the day, I'm pretty sure this one was the bundle I had as a kid. One game that caught my attention on that cartridge, especially being a big Ninja Turtles fan, was Revenge of Shinobi. Shinobi was a popular series back in the 80s and early 90s that started its roots at the arcades, but this was the first game in the series that was made for the console in mind, and at the time yet as good as one, with lots of detailed sprites and colour. I was in awe from the title screen that had a ninja that looked like a real one, to the first level transitioning from sunset to nighttime. And while now the fight in the nightclub is season-inducing, it was impressive seeing so much colour on one screen. The music was something that kicked with me too, composed by the talented Yuzo Koshiro, known for working on games like Kid Icarus Uprising, Ys 1 and 2, Etrian Odyssey, and Streets of Rage, who became the gold standard for creating music for the console. When I think of Mega Drive music, his work is the first that comes to mind. It's got a mix of traditional Japanese-style tracks like the first stage, to techno and jungle music. It's one of my favourite soundtracks for the system. There are a lot of pop culture references too, from the Terminator, Rambo to Godzilla, and in some of the early releases even had Batman and Spider-Man. While Sega didn't have the rights to Batman, Marvel gave them permission to use the web crawler in some of the later re-releases. I never completed the game until I was way older through the re-releases. I never got past the third stage, and I can see why. This game is tough, and in certain levels, unfair. The first level was easy enough, and you could beat the first boss without fully understanding the mechanics. But as soon as you get to the second stage, the one with the waterfall, it demands you to understand it, especially when it comes to the double jump. Unlike a lot of platformers with double jumps that you can press immediately, Shinobi's height is strict, as you have to hit it at the apex of the height, which as a kid I used to mess up a lot. And even now, I still mess up from time to time. Like Ghouls and Ghosts, the game requires a lot of patience, as enemies can come in all directions, with some wielding firearms. You play as VinSRC, taking down an evil organization and is armed with kunais and magic. No, these are limited. Kunais are easily found in the stages in crates. No bombs also appear in them, which can be annoying. Joe can select between 4 spells to choose from. The lightning one grants him a shield that can withstand a number of hits, a fire spell that hits full screen, a spell to make you jump higher, and a kamikaze spell that does a ton of damage on screen but uses a life in the process. If you have enough lives, you can continue on at the exact same spot. but if you use it on your last life, then it's game over. Most of the stages are fun, ranging from a Japanese village to Chinatown, but a few later levels can be a pain, especially in the final level, which is a large labyrinth that is annoying to navigate. The continues are limited, but the game has quite a number of options to make it easier or harder, from selecting the difficulty, the number of lives to start with, to how many kunais you can carry. It's not that old school difficulty, but I recommend giving it a go. The series was quite prominent on the console, getting 2 more installments, that being Shadow Dancer and Shinobi 3. Firstly, let's talk about Shadow Dancer, which plays more in line with the arcade titles than Revenge. In fact, this one is based on an arcade game with the same name, though the level designs are completely different. Instead of Joe, you play as Hayato, who must traverse through 5 stages each with 2 acts, and a boss fight, who must defuse a certain number of bombs in a time limit. It's less of a platformer and more of an action game, taking out enemies from all sides, with solutions and a limited number of magic spells. What sets Shadow Dancer apart is your canine companion, who can grab enemies from afar for you to go in for the kill, which deals well with the level design and enemy placement. Your pet isn't OP, as if you send it out while against the enemy with their guard up, then the guard will shrink and become defenseless for a small amount of time. It is a short, fun arcade experience that is a lot more generous than Revenge. If we are talking about the best Shinobi game, it has to be Shinobi 3, which is a direct sequel to Revenge, improving the foundations of that game and bringing back Joe in the starring role. Joe has his kunais and spells like before, but now he has more abilities that make him more agile. He can now run and perform a dash attack. He can climb on certain ceilings, wall jump, and dive kick. And the best thing is that all these moves are used to their fullest. The dive kick is incredibly useful, especially if you're trying to save ammunition. I feel the difficulty is a lot more fair than its predecessor, though still challenging, and the level design is a lot more varied, from secret laboratories to airships. They even have a few levels that change the gameplay slightly, such as the pseudo stealth level hiding from the disgusting biomonster to a surfing level fighting flying mechs. Certainly gave me Turtles in Time vibes. Being released during the middle of the console's lifespan, the game gets better, and while Yuzo Koshiro is absent, the music is still pretty good. If you play Transform, then you may recognize one of the tracks. This is my absolute favourite title out of the 3, and is probably up there as one of my favourites on the console. While Sega had popular IPs like Shinobi, there were plenty of games based on popular third-party properties, ranging from comic books, films, to pop singers, and even fizzy drink mascots. Sega themselves were even involved in some of these existing IPs, whether that be publishing them or even getting their hands on development, like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. One game they didn't develop but published was Disney's Aladdin, which was developed by Virgin Games. Being a Disney kid, I loved Aladdin, especially the music and the animation, and one of the striking things about the game is that they have chiptune versions of the soundtrack, which sounds great. The animation is phenomenal that references the movie, and the locations that the Cave of Wonders captures the look of the film. The animation style was so impressive that Nintendo caught wind of it, which led them into hiring Rare and using the Silicon graphics technology for my favourite trilogy of all time, Donkey Kong Country. The game's success led to more video game adaptations of popular Disney movies like The Lion King. I'm praising the soundtrack and the animation, but is it just painting a golden turd, or does it have value? The answer is yes. This game is just more than its looks. It is a fun, simple platformer where for the most part it feels nice to control and is pretty easy to get into, though I feel the Cave of Wonders is a slight spike in difficulty. The art can also get in the way, as in some places it's hard to tell whether something is a solid object or part of the scenery. I've done a couple of playthroughs of this game, and the second cave level running from the boulder always gives me trouble, but afterwards it's not too bad and lives are pretty easy to get, thanks to bonus levels and gems you can find to get extra continues. Owl can't jump on enemies, but he's armed with a sword to defend himself, as well as apples that can be thrown at enemies, which is my preferred way of attacking. The downside is that apples have limited ammunition, but can easily be restocked through the stages. This is an abridged version of the movie, so don't think of this as a replacement, but if you want a fun side-scroller, whether you're young or young at heart, then do check it out. Let's switch from platformers for now and talk about shmups, one of the more common genres on the platform. There is a decent library of them from Thunder Force 3 to Trapston, but I want to talk about two more obscure ones, that being Troubleshooter, otherwise known as Battlemania in Japan, and its sequel, Battlemania Daijendo. The first game, Troubleshooter, was released in 1991, and instead of flying a spaceship or a plane, you play as a duo of ladies simultaneously, Madison and Crystal, as they save a prince who has been kidnapped by some evil force, a role reversal from the likes of Super Mario Bros. Don't let the US box art fool you. Troubleshooter is a good time with anime-inspired character designs. The game and its sequel is goofy in tone with meta jokes and unusual enemy designs like in the first stage, where you fight some giant mech who attacks you with Japanese words. It was funny watching events unfold throughout my first playthrough, being surprised at the many wacky scenarios. What makes the game fun throughout 4 of the 5 stages is that you control both Maddie and Crystal as one unit. Maddie is always prone to fire from the right side, but you can switch where Crystal is facing with a press of a button, which gives you the option to have twice the firepower on one side or cover both sides of the screen. You also don't need to worry about Crystal, as only Maddie can get hurt from incoming enemies. Throughout most of the final stage, Crystal is removed from the equation, and without her, it feels kinda naked. At the start of each game, you can select between a dead selection of special moves, ranging from an all-screen attack to a giant ball swirling around Maddie. It was fun to experiment with the different special moves in each playthrough, though this is also taken away during the last parts of the game. You can get power-ups from each stage that increase in the firepower to change the speed of the game. This is more on the easier side of shmups, as instead of getting 1-ups, you have a number of hit points, which you can pick up more as you play. No, you only have about 3 continues. It's a good time, and one that I recommend for people new to shmups. Now, if you want to play it, get for alternative means, as this game is pricey. I feel like it could have done more with its mechanics, and thankfully the sequel provides. The sequel is a Japanese exclusive, so if you want to understand the synopsis, it might be a bit hard to understand, but thankfully the plot is not important to enjoy Battlemania Daijendo, as like many of its time, it's all about blasting enemies into dust. Most of the mechanics come back from the original, and I feel the levels use more of the game's mechanics, lasting a bit longer with 8 stages instead of 5. The levels are creative, changing how the screen moves, plus there's a couple levels that change up the formula, like in the 4th stage, where you're riding in a red car. The bosses are even more wacky than the original, like for example there is a boss fight where you fight a crane game machine, along with the toys inside it. The sound quality is better with more energetic music, and unlike the first game, the death screen isn't near as ear-draining. I don't have much to say about this one, and that won't make me repeat myself, but I will say this is a step up. After this one, the Gal Pals unfortunately disappeared, with their last appearance being in a cameo role in the Japanese Dreamcast RPG Sega Gaga. From blasting in the skies to on foot, we have an absolute classic. Gunstar Heroes is a run-and-gun game developed by Treasure, known for Radiant Silvergun, and during the 90s they were one of the more active developers, collaborating with Sega on many projects. You can play solo or with a friend blasting a wave of enemies using various weapons. What makes Gunstar Heroes a lot of fun is trying out different combinations, as while there are only 4 weapons to choose from, you can combine 2 of them together that will have different properties, like if you combine the flamethrower with the chaser, then you will fire a flame snake that will home around the nearest enemy, or you can combine 2 of the same weapon that will become twice as strong, like combining 2 machine guns that will make the bullets larger. Players also have melee attacks and can grab enemies or other players. You have quite a few decent mobility options like wall jumps and slides too. You can see any of the first 4 levels in any order, and most of these levels are a blast, each standing out from each other with their own unique gameplay features, from raiding an airship to riding on a minecart on all sides. There's even one stage that becomes a spacesuiter. The only part that was irritating was the dice spice level, especially when playing co-op, as it removes the ability to play together simultaneously until you get to the boss of that level. The game is pretty fair too, with unlimited continues, and unlike a similar game Metal, you don't die in one hit. The visuals are incredibly impressive with many pseudo 3D sprites and Mode 7 style backgrounds. I had a blast playing this with my good buddy Paul SRC, who you should follow on Twitch. Run and Done games were made for friends. After Gunstar Heroes, Treasure became a name to recognize for all action fans. The Mega Drive was their golden era as they provided 5 more games on the system, and today I'll be talking about one of them. Say hello to Dynamite Headdy. Dynamite Headdy stars a puppet, named Headdy, who goes through 9 bizarre stages in which he uses his head to attack enemies, grab objects, and reach items from a distance. He can gain temporary power-ups, such as a vacuum, a spreader, as well as a hammer, which are fun and varied. Now there is the Buddha statue that makes Headdy vulnerable for a while, which is annoying during boss fights. After finishing the opening act, you are able to freely experiment with your abilities with optional minigames that are a fun way to teach you the mechanics before you jump off the deep end. The first 2 levels are easy enough, but the game becomes very challenging as soon as the 5th stage starts with tough bosses. And unlike Gunstar Heroes, continues are limited. Fortunately, you can gain extra continues by collecting 13 of these rotating objects at the end of each stage. If you are familiar with Castlevania 3, then you may know that the international version is harder than the original Japanese version, which was pretty common during that period of time. Dynamite Headdy is no exception, as besides some of the cosmetic changes, bosses have more health, with slightly altered enemy patterns, and the requirements to get continues is stricter. You can get access to the Japanese version if you have the Mega Drive collection or the Mega Drive Mini 2 if you want a more lax experience. Treasure knows how to push the system's graphics, as Dynamite Headdies are top notch. But they weren't just for show, as Treasure used them to create some imaginative stages, like the pseudo 3D tilting platform in stage 3 or the rotating tower in stage 5. The bosses are also memorable, like the first boss where you fight in the middle of an orchestra playing the Nutcracker, or the boss where the arena rotates pushing Headdy into the background. Like Treasure's other words, there's even a rail shooter stage. With an hour or 2 runtime, Headdy does a lot to spice things up, as well as just having many secrets which are hard to find. You will have a boiler time with this one. While the console was mostly known for shmups, sports and action games, the console had its fair share of adventure and RPG titles. If you're an old school RPG fan, then you may have heard about the Phantasy Star series. I've heard about them way back on the Ultimate collection back on the PlayStation 3, but it felt daunting at the time due to being an RPG from the 80s. It wasn't until last year that I played the ages version of the first title on the Switch that I decided to give it a go. Thankfully, it was pretty easy to get into thanks to having a built-in map system, as well as increasing the amount of currency and experience points you get. It was thanks to ZaffreRevolution's Phantasy Star Retrospective series that made me decide to take the leap into the Algo system. Since then, I played 2 more titles. One of them is Phantasy Star Online with a couple of friends, which was thanks to a group of individuals who kept the servers running. The other I will be talking about is a direct sequel to the first title, Phantasy Star II. Man, even back when I had the Ultimate collection, I thought this title screen was gorgeous, and the theme behind it? Stunning. This is a JRPG set over 1,000 years over the original game, where the planet Moctavia, that was once something out of Dune, is thriving with lush green grass and running water thanks to the advanced supercomputer Mother Brain. It stars a man named Rolf, who wakes up from a nightmare seeing a lady fight a mysterious dark creature. He is then assigned to investigate the growing increase of biomonsters, but then gradually reveals something more sinister and complex. Thinking it was a JRPG from 1989, I didn't think it would be that deep in world building and plot. And yeah, the characters Baron, Rolf and Ney aren't nothing worth to write about, and some of the NPCs don't have much to say besides giving you cues for the next objective, but this was a great science fiction story that got me thinking the reliance on technology, how people can abuse it, the true meaning of free will, and whether or not the ends justify the means. While there have been hundreds of RPGs since then that are well written with grander technology backing them up, for a game that came out in 1989, the subjects it tackles are still relative, heck even more so today with the likes of social media that people use to manipulate the general public, AI and so forth. It got me thinking about Tales of Vesperia, where the citizens of that town uses devices known as Blastia to protect themselves from monsters amongst other things, but are abused by the higher-ups, as well as finding out that the Blastia cause harm to the environment, which can be connected to how people over-rely on Mother Brain's tech that even the slightest of hiccups can cause disasters to the planet, and how it can be abused by anyone. Now, being an old-school JRPG from over 35 years, it does have some gameplay elements that aren't very friendly, such as having no map. The game originally came with a guide, which you can find a PDF for online, or you can look up walkthroughs. I admit that even with a guide, I did get lost a few times, especially in dungeons, where things looked samey, with plenty of flaws and pitfalls in the way. Grinding is another hurdle too, as it takes a while to level up, and every new party member you start off with begins at level 1. I don't normally encourage mods to make the game better, as I tend to judge the game on its own merit, but I did use a mod for Phantasy Star II that cut down the fat by increasing gold and experience points. I still got a similar experience as I did without one, but as a busy adult, time is precious and I would like to spend on things I enjoy and not spend hours mindlessly grinding. This is meant to be the hardest out of the quadrilogy, but hey, I like the chance, which PS2 certainly provides. There are a total of 8 party members to choose from. No, you can only have 4 at a time, so if you ever want to replay the game or swap between them, then you can provide that good old replay value. You have characters like Amy who can provide heals and buffs, to Kane who can turn robots into a bunch of scraps. People often compare this game to the likes of mid-90s RPGs like Final Fantasy VI, which is unfair being nearly half a decade apart. It was pretty advanced during its era, as not only competing against the original Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, which looks miles better, but for us Europeans who never got those two till years later, it was one of the few JRPGs available to us at the time. Phantasy Star II is something I would recommend for any JRPG fan who may want to go back in time and try some of the more retro ones. It actually made me want to consider hopping on more old school JRPGs. While we had a few RPGs like the previously mentioned Phantasy Star II, Sega seemed to be overshadowed by the Super Nintendo when it came to the genre, which was growing in popularity in Japan, so the company decided to create the Meta Roleplay project, which included 7 JRPGs from different developers, one of them being developed by Neztec, which were known previously as Ghouls Entertainment, who worked on a run-and-gun game called Ranger X. Neztec's game for this project was titled Radna Centy in Japan, otherwise known as Crusader Centy in the USA and CA in Europe. Despite being advertised as a RPG, CA is more of an adventure game like A Link to the Past, or more accurately, Star Tropics. But you know, some people consider Zelda as an RPG. Genres are so dumb. Instead of stuff like experience points, MPs and such, our main hero Corona gradually gains new abilities throughout his journey and recruits various animals. Unlike Link, who has an army of tools at his disposal, Corona only wields a sword, but he's able to throw it like a boomerang, which is used to solve various puzzles and combat situations. The boomerang was always one of my favourite weapons in the Zelda franchise, so having a game based around it is awesome, and it's used creatively. The sword's hitbox is pretty jank with no upgrades, but the main base of attack simply thrown it at enemies, which makes it a lot more fun. The animal buddies you find throughout your journey give Corona's sword unique abilities, like the penguin gives his blade ice properties, and the flying swirl allows the weapon to ricochet off the walls. My absolute favourite is probably the butterfly you get halfway through, which allows you to free control your sword for a limited time. You can have two animals equipped at once, and while not every critter has a unique combination, you can combine their powers to give you unique properties, like the butterfly and flying swirl makes the sword spin around Corona. I do wish every animal has a unique combination, but what's available is still fun to experiment. The story starts out pretty vanilla, starring a boy who just turned 14 years old, which in this world is the age when boys become adventurers. During his adventure, however, he uses the ability to speak to other humans in exchange for plants and animals. There is a decent twist around the second half of the campaign that tackles the standard saving the world trope, but I felt some of the arts felt kind of rushed. I played the European version of the game through the Mega Drive Mini 2, which is apparently more close to the Japanese script, while I hear the US version by Atlas is a bit more loose and weaker than the European version by Sega. I do like some of the events that unfold, that there is one point where you get turned into a slime and become the prey from another hero. The plot is okay, but for me the main appeal is the presentation and the gameplay. I said it felt more like Star Tropics instead of Zelda, as like the Procad in Star Tropics, Corona has the ability to jump, which is used often in various puzzles, plus it's a more linear experience with no connected overworld. Instead, there are different zones by a connected map. You revisit some of the zones throughout the adventure, which some people may criticize, but I like it as it makes the world much more alive, revisiting old NPCs, plus some areas do exchange on both thematically and layout. There isn't much to go out of your way to go off course from the main campaign, besides the golden apples that can grant you an extra health point, which is disappointing as I would have loved to see some side quests that expands on the world more. But where it lacks in replayability, it makes up for it as a comfort adventure game with solid mechanics, colourful sprites, and simple but fun puzzles. Sifting from a top-down adventure to a side-scroller adventure, we entered the world of monsters with the Wonder Boy series, otherwise known as the Monster World series, one of Sega's oldest franchises, developed by Westone, that started out as an arcade platformer and then expanded into 2D adventures. Today I will be looking at Monster World 4, the 6th game in the series? Hang on a sec. This series timeline is weird, not to mention the non-Sega ones. In Monster World 4, you play as Asa, one of the only few Wonder Girls who goes on a journey to save the spirits and the world. If you're a fan of Zelda 2 or the Centy games, then you may be attracted into trying out Monster World 4, especially with the Arabian theme like the latter, where you explore 5 dungeons, each with their own unique obstacles. Asa is equipped with a sword where she slashes and thrusts into her enemies, as well as a shield where she can block incoming attacks. Unlike her previous heroes, as well as Link and Centy, she doesn't have any magic capabilities, but near the beginning of the game, she raises a little fairy companion called a Pepper that grows after each dungeon and to be used in various situations, such as being used to guide, protect her from falling rocks, uncover secret doors, and so many more. Activating the Pepper with the A button is context sensitive, that will trigger various outcomes in the dungeons, and while the dungeons themselves aren't complex, they are fun to interact with. I enjoy the water dungeon where you navigate a series of pipes and putting out fires with your furry friend, as well as a bucket you find specifically for that dungeon. The game itself is pretty straightforward with little exploration outside of the dungeons, with only the one town being the centre of attention. The only items that aren't used specifically for those dungeons are gold pieces, your currency, gold bars which can be traded for currency, and the blue life drops that can increase your max health. However, once you beat a dungeon, there is no way of going back, so if you are a completionist playing it on the vintage sections, where achievements are available, then you may not like it. But I don't think completion is something that Monster World 4 encourages, and to me it's meant to be played at your own leisure. There are plenty of life drops you can get, with 150 in total, and getting 10 of them grants an extra heart. To me, it just makes the game a bit more forgiving. You can also equip new armor, swords, and shields that will increase your health, strength, and sometimes resist certain magic types. Now, unlike a lot of RPGs or Zelda titles, these equipment will actually replace the current one. It's not a big issue as most of the new equipment will be better than the one you already have. While there's only a single account, not including the Pro-Yard one, gives me a sense of familiarity and strengthens some of the NPCs you visit. I played a few of the Wonder Boy titles, but out of all of them, this one feels the best to control and how easy it is to jump in. The visuals are excellent with some excellent parry-axe throwing, colours and cartoony pixel art that puts its 3D remake to shame, which proves that 2D sprites are still worth investing in this day and age. Monster World 4 became one of my favourite titles on the Mega Drive, and while for the time it was a Japanese exclusive, it got a re-release via the Vintage TXN on Xbox Live and PSN, as well as the Mega Drive Mini and the Wonder Boy TXN on all modern platforms, so you have no excuse not to play it. While a lot of people don't think too highly of Konami nowadays, there were some of the all-time greats, even before the likes of Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid. The 16-bit generation was where Konami were in their prime, putting out classics after classics. If you saw their names on the cover, chances are it was good. Today I will be mentioning two of their titles, with the first one being from their Ghouls series, Castlevania. Castlevania The New Generation, otherwise known as Castlevania Bloodlines in the US, was Sega's first action when it came to the franchise. Being from the UK, I'm usually a defender when it comes to the Power Region names. However, the US wins when it comes to this title. They also won when it came to this game, as while there isn't any big difference between the two, New Generations was censored, removing blood, hanging corpses, and crows feeding the dead body in the first stage. This title is set during World War I, where evil Countess Elisabeth Bartley, inspired by the infamous Hungarian serial killer Elisabeth Bathory, is attempting to resurrect Count Dracula from his slumber. You have a choice between John Morris, a nod to Quincy Morris from Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, who plays identical to the Belmonts with the vampire killer whip to boot, and Alucard, who wields the Alucard spear. John's use of the vampire killer isn't as versatile as Simon's in Castlevania 4, only having the ability to whip diagonally and downward in the air, but he can use his whip to grapple onto ceilings. Both characters control well, though it took me a while to adjust John's ability to swing across the ceilings. Alucard is my favourite to play as he has a yawn reach, can attack in multiple directions on the ground, and can perform a Super Mario Bros. 2 jump, reaching new areas that John cannot get to. Plus, it can be used to skip certain parts of the levels, making him the unofficial easy version. I always found spears to be cool weapons, making him one of my favourite playable vampire hunters. Of course, like in Castlevania fashion, the secondary weapons make a return with their own dedicated button, but you can press up on the D-pad along with the item button to perform a more powerful attack, no, not to the extent of Rondo of Blood. Instead of just trekking through Dracula's castle, you travel across Europe, going to Greece, Italy, Germany, France and England, showing off historical landmarks like the Tower of Pisa and the Palace of Versailles. Having the stages based on the many European countries makes Bloodlines stand out, and putting into good use showing off the Mega Drive's technical prowess, like the reflection in the water in Greece, the sprite rotation during the Italy stage boss fight, and the mirrors in the England stage. Compared to the other titles, this one is easier than the first game and Dracula's Curse, but harder than say Super Castlevania 4. I never found any BS moments, though I have put a lot more time into this one than the Nintendo Adventures. The only downside is that you have limited continues, but I find that they don't hinder much with the experience, and if you are playing this on the TXN or NSO, then this isn't an issue. The music is incredible, composed by Mitsuyo Yamane, who began her contributions to the series with this very title. Many of the series staples like Iron Blue Intention and The Sinking Old Century were first heard in this game, and her contribution to this title is one of the examples that the Mega Drive to perform great music with the right people on board. It is one of my favourite OSTs on the console, and is one of my favourite soundtracks from the Castlevania franchise alongside Rondo of Blood. In fact, Blood Giants is my second favourite Castlevania title, just behind Rondo. Blood Giants is just one of the many examples that Konami was once home to talented developers. Even though Konami brought many of their franchises onto Sega's black box, they also pumped a couple of original titles too. The 16-bit generation was the period where many developers decided to create anthropomorphic heroes since Sonic's popularity, and Konami were no different. Rotten Knight Adventures stars a possum named Sparkster who must save a princess from the Pig Army blasting through 7 stages. He is equipped with a sword that fires little beams, but if you hold the attack button with the direction you are holding, then Sparkster will boost like a rocket, and can ricochet off solid objects, which is your main offensive option. If you are familiar with Freedom Planet, then you may recognize how it functions. If you hold the attack button without moving into a direction, then he will perform a spin attack, which does consecutive damage that destroys bosses. It's simple to control, and it starts out pretty easy, but if you're playing on normal, then it does get pretty challenging. Makes sense since this is the same team who worked on the Contra games. No, it's not as hard as those. Rotten Knight Adventures is one of those situations where the difficulty settings were renamed and slightly adjusted. If you play on the US and Europe's easy mode, then you won't reach the true ending. The difficulties change the number of lives and continues you have. Each level does something interesting, like the one where you're riding on a minecart, and one where you are traversing through a cave that has rocks covered on top, making you look at the reflection of the lava to see where you are platforming, using its cool tech and implement it into gameplay. There are even a couple of smut sections, and these are a ton of fun. It got 2 sequels, one on the same console and one for the Super Nintendo, and it got a reboot of sorts back on Xbox Live and Steam. It was stuck on the console, but this year it got bundled into a collection with the other 16-bit games on all modern platforms. I still need to play the other games, but the first Rotten Knight is one of the best platformers on the console and is still remembered fondly amongst a lot of retro fans. However, when it comes to perhaps the best non-Sonic platformer on the system, then we can get no further than the final game on this video. The Mega Drive had a pretty lengthy life, pumping out tons of games even when the PlayStation and the Saturn hit store shelves, which while wasn't Sega's best decision, showing that this old 16-bit device still had plenty up its sleeves, one of them being from the now called Sonic team. This isn't a ranking video, but like my games I played in a year videos, I usually leave my favourites for last. Ristar isn't my favourite on the console, that would be Sonic 2, but Ristar is real darn close. The game started out as one of the original ideas for Sonic 1, where you control a rabbit who would extend their ears to grab objects and enemies. This was dropped in favour of the Blue Hedgehog, but some of the ideas are too good to leave in the past. You play as a shooting star named after the titular character who goes through the galaxy to stop an evil group of aliens from taking over. Like the original concept, Ristar is able to stretch his arms in multiple directions to grab enemies and various objects, either to attack or even to traverse and solve problems. He can grab onto these bars that with enough spins makes him blast off that can damage enemies around him, as well as bounce off walls to reach new heights. He swims like a pro, who is much faster than on the ground and can freely move around it in 8 directions. Besides that, there isn't much to his move kit, but with the runtime, the game pulls off all these mechanics in creative and fun ways. This little fellow isn't much of a runner, as the game is more about smelling the roses and exploring with the kit he has on him. There are a few things to discover like multiple paths, treasures and bonus rooms with the actor, while not mandatory to get a true ending, does give you neat codes you can insert to give you things like a level select, sound test, boss rushes and more. If you know the codes or get them up, you can just put them in without entering these rooms, but I always love cheat codes in my games that give you fun extras. If it was made today, these will be either through updates or DLC. Ristar is such a colourful game that has your usual forest, water and ice levels, but does them so well with the second world Undertow being one of the best water levels ever. The fire level having fjords blow up that changes the entire terrain, and the ice level where even Ristar on idle allows him to make a snowball where he can use it to damage the snow mini-boss. He has plenty of item animations depending on which level he's in, from sweating in the fire stage to tapping his feet to the music in Planet Sonata. The game is so much fun with a lot of time that is perfect to spend an hour or two. If you love 2D platformers, you need to play it. These games I've mentioned show how amazing the console actually is, starting out to promote how advanced the games can run 80s arcade titles to become a 16-bit console powerhouse with a gallery of cool playthings. I may sound like a boomer when I say this, but a lot of the modern consoles, minus the Switch, lack any identity, feeling more like an entertainment system that is bundled with games. This is probably because you can play a majority of games on these systems, but back then, consoles like the Dreamcast, PS1, DS, and the Mega Drive felt like they had things to call them unique. Whether it be the DS's dual screen, the Dreamcast's VMUs and arcade perfections, and the PS1's exclusives at the time showing off the capability of 3D graphics. When I think of the games I mentioned in this video, I think of the Mega Drive, despite the grand majority of them being available practically everywhere now, whether it be in compilations or standalone re-releases, and even games like Mania being accessible through the power of the internet. While we get a lot of re-releases for some of the console's libraries, like it was expected, shows that these games should not be ignored through time. No, Sega, if you could pump out some of your arcade, Saturn and Dreamcast games, that would be great. I had a lot of fun replaying old classics and discovering others, which made me realise how much I adore Sega. There are still a ton of great games on the console, which I may cover in the future. But before I go, I would love to know what are some of your favourite games on the platform in the comments below, and I hope you guys have a marvellous day.